Yo, what's up, everyone? It's Josh Tongol here, and welcome to the Flipside Podcast. And it's been a while since I've had a guest on the show, but we are back, and I'm excited about today's guest. His name is Graham Nicholls, and Graham Nicholls has had hundreds of out-of-body experiences, and he's a world-recognized expert on the subject, and he speaks on many areas of spirituality, art, and psychical research, and he's been featured on the BBC and in the Times, and has authored the books Navigating the Out-of-Body Experience and Avenues of the Human Spirit. So Graham, it's good to have you on the show, man.
Good to be here.
Awesome. There's a lot of things we could talk about when it comes to the topic of consciousness, but for the sake of my viewers or my listeners, I want to narrow things down a bit, because for the past several months, I've been doing a series on YouTube on out-of-body experiences, addressing what it's all about, its benefits, the misconceptions, and even sharing some of my own personal out-of-body journeys. But based on the comments and the messages that I received from my listeners, of whom many are like former or progressive Christians, even atheists and agnostics, so I tend to attract a variety of different types of backgrounds, But I can honestly say, at least in my opinion, that there's a lot of misconceptions out there, about out-of-body experiences. And so, either based upon their religious or even their materialist assumptions. And so I want to tackle a couple of issues today that could hopefully clear things up for them, because my plan is to bring this topic to the forefront of certain communities that I know and help spread some knowledge about this stuff because, hopefully it'll create some dialogue. And I've read a lot, and I've watched a lot of material on OBEs and NDEs throughout the years. But, what I liked about you, bro, was that there was no hype, like you've debated reputable skeptics, and your approach, from what I've noticed so far, is just very calm and chill, like very scientific, without all the, I guess you could say, like the esoteric jargon that's usually associated with this topic. You know what I'm saying? And so let's get into it. Let's first start off with a definition. So, Graham, what is your definition of an out-of-body experience or an OBE?
Okay, well, I guess there's two levels to the answer to that question, actually, because there's the level of what we personally experience. So that would be something like feeling that we've floated out of our body, gone to another location. It's more the experiential level. So the is floating above yourself, looking down at your body, but that's very limited as well, because also many people will go off out of the room. They'll go into a different country altogether, maybe onto another level of what they believe another level of reality, or there's all kinds of different types of experiences you can have. And then I think on the second level of answering that question is what might actually be going on, and that's a much more tricky question to answer, because at the moment we don't have all the science to really fully understand what's going on, but there are different interpretations. So there's the more esoteric framework, which argues that there's some kind of body made of some kind of energy, and that comes out, maybe even multiple bodies, and that travels away from you. Then there's the more scientific framework, where people will say that it's more like the brain is entangled. There's the concept in quantum physics that the brain could be entangled through some kind of quantum effect, and therefore information can be received at a distance, or you can almost have some kind of interconnection with the world around you. So there's different theories. But the experiential part is quite consistent, that people will have some feeling of floating out of the body and to another location.
Okay. So which one would you mostly lean towards?
Well, as you said at the beginning, I go more with the scientific.
Okay. Makes sense.
It just makes more sense to me, and I think there's some problems with the sort of energy body ideas. I think. For example, the fact that energy body is often perceived as wearing clothes and things like that, which
right.
That's just off of the top of my head one example. And if it is just a pure energetic thing, it's not to do with something to do with our sense of self and our identity and our projection of our own way of seeing ourselves, then you would expect it to look differently. So there's some problems with that. I think.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess the first level you were talking about was more so like there's this actual feeling that you are coming out of your body. That's something that I've even experienced where I do literally feel like I'm coming out of my body. But then I guess the second level you're referring to is that maybe it's not necessarily you coming out, but there's this entanglement where there's a sense of, I guess, would you just say more of like a shift in consciousness?
Yeah, sure. I think once you start to get into it, it could be multiple things going on as well. We also have to remember that it doesn't have to be either or.
Right.
There could be multiple aspects. If we think about our own brains and our own awareness of the world and things like that, our sensory experience of the world, it's not just made up from one sense. It's not just seeing or it's not just touch. It's a combination of different things that build up our sense of where we are in the world and then also our sense of who we are in the world. So there's different stages and different aspects to that. And I think with an out of body experience, it's probably working in a similar way.
Right, right. And I'm glad you kind of put it that way. It's not just this either or thing, but you're open to the different possibilities, because people have their experiences and what they actually felt like the way it was. But then there's I guess, a scientific aspect to it, of just the understanding of entanglement and all those things. But since this is your first time on the show, I would like you to kind of like introduce and, just tell us a little bit about yourself and your story and how you kind of ended up exploring all of a sudden, being an expert or an authority on this subject.
Well, I guess it started for me. I mean, if we go right back, really, it started for me as a small child, around 5 years old. I started to have perceptions, not out of body experiences at that point. It was more perceptions and what seemed to be memories and different things that unfortunately I didn't write them down, so
Sure,
my memory is quite vague of them.
right, right.
But I'm aware that I had these memories of what I guess could have been some kind of past life or something of that uh, kind of category, or maybe I was picking up information in a sort of psychic sense. So I guess I was sort of tuned into that kind of thing, and then I saw a figure standing in my doorway one night. I got out of bed, went into my hallway to go to the bathroom, and there was a tall figure standing there that didn't do anything, didn't move. It just looked at me. And at the time, I was quite scared, as you would imagine. A small child, I was very, very sort of terrified of what happened. But then later, as I thought about it, actually nothing negative was involved. It was actually a very positive experience in many ways. It showed me essentially that there was a feeling that there was more beyond. There was a sense even that this figure was kind of like a guardian or standing at a kind of threshold between two levels or something of that nature. So although I don't know what that was, and it's that you can put that into whatever framework of thinking you want to, the important factor was that it started me thinking about what all this might be, and as I approached my teens and entered my teens, and I started to have some spontaneous out of body experiences, and then I researched it and I learned to induce them myself from that point on. So that's sort of the journey. It was with me from the beginning in some form or another, I guess.
Okay. I mean, so did you not have any religious background at all?
No, no. My family, like most British families in England, they don't. A lot of them don't really pay that much attention to religion anymore. So although my mother would probably say she was Christian, I never saw her ever do anything that you would sort of consider Christian in the sense of like going to a church or anything like that. And my father, I guess my father would probably say he was agnostic or something like that. But But in essence, I think a lot of the values maybe that you could attribute in it to some degree. I mean, my mother was a carer for most of her life, so she spent her entire life helping others and has based her entire life around caring and compassion, really. So
Yeah. Okay, so the virtues were there, right?
yeah.
Okay. I mean, so like as you were saying earlier, your first, at least from what you can remember, was when you were 5 years old, but it was more of like you saw like some sort of apparition or something, but it wasn't necessarily an OBE until you said when you were a teenager, right?
About 12 was when the first out of body experiences happened.
Yeah. And you mentioned it was spontaneous, right? I mean, why don't you kind of unpack like what happened?
Okay, well, the spontaneous ones were very brief. I had a series of maybe three or four of them, and they were all pretty much the same. I would lay down, and I had a feeling that something was shifting within me. Now, I guess in retrospect, I would say that essentially I was going into some kind of trance state, and I was going into something akin to sort of deep meditation. To this day, I still have an ability to very easily go into a very deep meditation and trance states and things like that. It seems to be something, a natural gift, if you like, that I have. Um, so at that time, I went into that kind of state, and then almost like in a split second, I found myself. Um, One of the ones I have the best memory of was in my school playground, which was maybe half a mile from where I lived, and I found myself back at the school, and I was in the playground, but I was above the ground. I was maybe sort of 2 feet or something off the ground, and I was just kind of floating there, and I didn't know what was happening, and I looked around. There was no one else there, which was obviously, not how I would usually experience that the school. And as I looked around, I thought, this is so intensely real and vivid, and I was like, this isn't a dream. What's happening? And then almost as soon as I had that thought, I was back in my physical body, and that happened, like I say, I think about 3 times. Um, and then I heard about the subject.
Oh, so
I
you
think
didn't know about like the whole idea of
I
out of
no
body.
no
Okay.
no I didn't know what it was at all. I heard about the concept. It was about 6 months or a year later. I I don't remember whether it was in a newspaper or whether it was on the television. I'm not really sure, but I heard the concept somewhere. And the main thing was that I got inspired to find out about it. So I walked to the local bookshop, um, had a look in there, and they did have one book on out of body experiences called Out of Body Experiences, a handbook by a
Mm.
parapsychologist called
Yeah.
Janet Lee Mitchell.
Hmm.
And that book, which put it all in a kind of scientific framework, right from the very first book I read, gave me some insights into what the experience might be and how potentially I could induce it. So that was where it started properly, really.
Yeah. I mean, so why didn't it like scare you? Like when you, I mean, if it wasn't a familiar concept in your mind at the time, like what drew you to want to learn more about it?
Well, it was a very positive feeling. I guess, like a lot of people will describe with near-death experiences, there's that feeling of sort of light and compassion and um, love, really. There's a very, very positive feeling. And all of my out of body experiences in the sort of the early stages of my learning all had that quality, and most of them do to this day. So that was very much what I guess made it not a scary experience for me. I mean, the only time I've ever been scared with any of my experiences really was that very first one, and I think that was just because it was so outside of what I understood to be possible or real, I guess, at that point. So um,
So obviously, yeah, those were spontaneous ones in the beginning, and then you were saying that I guess you eventually learned to kind of induce it, self-initiate your OBE. So like how did that work? And like how long did it take till you were finally able to do it?
Well, at the time, there weren't many books on the subject. There wasn't much information at all. There was no internet then, so my approach was to just use this one technique that was in the back of the book I mentioned, which was essentially just imagining you were floating on clouds, which I now know is not really a very good technique, but but it was all I had at the time, and I I don't know. I had this very unusual, I guess, for my age and background, I had this very unusual level of discipline in terms of this particular area, and I really wanted to do it. So I spent 6 months essentially every single night. I didn't miss a single night in 6 months, and I did it every night. Um, Consistently, and I spent about an hour every single night. I've got all the diary entries right from that time, so it's quite nice. I wrote down the start time, the end time, anything that happened. I wrote everything down. Um, so yeah, I spent 6 months, and I was essentially at the point of giving up. That's sort of almost the key factor in a way, because what happened was I realized that, well, I didn't realize, I realized afterwards, but I was at the point of giving up, so I just sort of let go in a way. I wasn't so focused on it, but I wanted to keep the consistency. I think I'd said to myself that I was going to try for a year, and then if it didn't work, then I would forget about it. But I was going to try for a year. That was my plan. So I wanted to stick to that commitment. Um, and I laid there, and I sort of lost the drive in a sense, but that was actually the good thing, because what it meant was I let go, I relaxed, and I let go. Whereas before, I had this belief that it was all about willpower and projection, this
Right.
astral projection thing. I thought I had to project, so I had all these concepts in my mind that were actually untrue. And when I relaxed, I felt this huge surge of energy go through my body. Like it felt like as intense as some sort of lightning striking or something like that, but not negative or painful in any way. Actually, a very positive, almost like all of the stress and negativity and emotion and all of that, everything all just releasing in a second. Um, then, as I became aware again, I realized I was looking down at myself from above, and that was my first induced experience.
Wow. So I mean, you were really determined, man, to at least commit to a year, but you did it within 6 months, you said?
Yeah, it took six
Yeah. I
months.
mean, so pretty much every day, you said you didn't miss a day. So you were basically doing the whole cloud, visualizing yourself on a cloud kind of thing, and it just wasn't working.
No, the problem with it, if I was evaluating that technique now, is the problem with it is it had no focus, it had no direction, and I think that's quite key in techniques, because if you don't have any focus or direction, then your mental focus and your energy, if you like, it's not condensed or focused into one particular direction, which is quite important, I think. So.
Yeah, yeah. Were your OBEs very physical, or were they non-physical, or both? Can you kind of just give us a general idea of what these OBEs are like?
I think they are a combination of both. I think that some experiences feel very physical. I've had experiences where I've been very rooted to the ground. Feel like I'm standing there physically. Everything around me looks very vivid, almost more vivid sometimes than my physical sight. I do wear glasses, for example, when I'm reading text at a distance and things like that. I'm a bit short-sighted. So, but when I'm in the out of body experience, in those really heightened, really ultra clear experiences, I'll have vision that's better than my physical vision. Whereas in other experiences, I might see what seem to be energies. It's almost like I'm seeing colors and energies related to physical things, or uh, that kind of experience. Then there's experiences that seem to be more in another level of reality altogether, something more akin to an afterlife. In some ways, be very much like classical descriptions from different religions or different near-death experiences and things like that. One example is what I call the more Summerland-like levels, where it is almost like a lush, beautiful, Earth-like environment, but is full of very vivid light. The colors are beyond anything that we usually describe or imagine. Um, Other environments seem to be very misty and otherworldly. There doesn't seem to be up or down. There doesn't seem to be any real time in the normal sense that we understand time. So those kinds of levels are very interesting as well. They have a whole different kind of feeling to the physical. So yeah, there's the spectrum, I guess you could say, of different types of experience. The way you see, the way you feel, the way the environment feels. It's different within different experiences.
Yeah. I mean, so I guess this would might open up a can of worms because, in the sense of like the way religion views these kinds of things is kind of a pretty much for the most part, at least for, let's just say, like a typical American evangelical Christians or something. When you die, it's kind of like a heaven or hell, and that's pretty much it. You know what I'm saying? But you're kind of describing that there are different, I guess, would you say like levels of reality?
It seems like it, but we don't really know exactly what's going on with that either. So it's a bit like the question of the bodies and or whether it's some kind of extended mind. I mean, it could be that we're experiencing a joint a joining of all of our conscious awareness all across the world, almost like if you think about it like a computer, almost like a network of consciousness. It could be something like that, but it could also then be a literal, if you interpret things more in religious context, then maybe you could see it as the afterlife or heaven or whatever context you want to see it in. I guess from my perspective, I'm very open. I don't know what the answer is yet, and I'm really fascinated by what the options are and all the different possibilities of what could be the answer to these questions. So I guess that's how I look at it.
Okay. I mean, but just kind of jumping back to that whole idea of the afterlife, though, have you ever encountered like someone who recently died, that while you were out of your body?
Yes, well, the most powerful example of that was what Raymond Moody would call a shared death experience,
Right.
which was essentially where I had an out of body experience. It was unusual because it was in the morning as well. Because usually my experiences are more in the evening, but this experience was in the morning, and I found myself in essentially the environment I was just describing. This misty, unusual environment that didn't seem to have any up or down or sense of time or anything like that. It was all just this kind of almost as if you were on clouds. I mean, it sounds very cliche, but I mean, really, that's what it looked like, as if you were standing on an environment of cloud. Um, and around, obviously, it's hard to estimate distance because of that, but it was around 200 meters from me. I could see a group of people, 150, 140 or so people, who all seemed confused, and they were in different stages of what seemed to be their life review. If you've read anything about near death experiences, you'll know that people often will see a retelling of their whole lives. They'll see key memories, they'll see uh, glimpses of things that maybe they didn't feel good about or things that they did feel good about. All these different things will unravel and unfold in this life review experience that they have. And I was watching all these people, and some of them I was literally seeing glimpses of their life reviews. I have this vivid image of this man who seemed to be seeing, I guess maybe it could have been his father or something like that, but he was seeing this very um, sort of worn face, someone who looked like they work in the outside, very leathery kind of skin and very dark tan, as if they'd worked outside for many years, and he seemed to be struggling with his life review, like he had things he needed to resolve. And then over the other side of this group, there was, I think it was a woman, but it was hard to tell at the distance, and she seemed to be drifting off into the cloud and disappearing, almost like she was going to the next stage. And she didn't seem to have so many issues that she needed to go through. So it was almost like this was the first stage of an afterlife experience. But the really fascinating thing was I got this sense that they were something European, were non-English speaking, and that I thought that they'd all died together in a very almost like instantaneously,
Like an accident or something.
yeah, like an accident. And the interesting thing was, I think within a couple of hours or so, I'm not exactly sure of the time frame, but not long after, I walked into the living room. I was still living with my father at the time, and I walked into the living room, and there was on the news a plane crash that had happened in an island off of Norway, and 140 people had died in the crash. And it had happened at the same time that my out of body experience had happened.
Huh. Yeah, that's interesting. Huh. So, I mean, when you were observing this, did you have like a physical body, or was it more like a movie, like like you're watching just like some sort of screen in front of you?
No, I felt that I was standing there on this strange canopy of cloud. I felt that I was standing there, but I felt that I couldn't go any closer to them. I was around, like I said, around 200 meters, something like that. I'm not, and I couldn't go any closer. And I felt, I think many people have described with afterlife experiences, with near-death experiences, the out-of-body experience part of the near-death experience, that they'll go to this other level and they'll pass on, or others passing on, but they won't be able to go past a certain point. Like if they go past a certain point, then they won't be able to go back. And maybe I had something in a kind of similar context, that I felt that I couldn't go to where they were. I could only watch, but I felt I was on the same level as them, pretty much, maybe slightly, but pretty much on a plane with them. I was watching them as if I was just standing at the other end of the street or something.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty powerful experience, especially for someone who's probably skeptical of these kinds of things. I guess that would be considered like a vertical type of evidence. If it were, if it was confirmed that that's an actual plane, who knows, right? I mean, were you able to kind of dig deeper into that story, or not so much of like the whole incident?
Yeah. There was even another experience that sort of more recently, two more experiences later on that seemed to connect with it. But and but I think the key part was, I wouldn't say I'm skeptical. I'd say that the way I look at it is I'm just sort of open, and I don't want to say this is how it is, because I think when you do that, you stop learning, and you stop looking, and you stop being open. And I want to be able to change my mind. I want to be able to learn, and I want to be able to take the lessons that the experiences give me. And that's the key focus for me, I guess. So that's sort of how I approach it.
Yeah. No, it's cool. I'm glad you shared that story, because, like I said, there's a certain type of person that usually watches my videos, because, like I said, some of them are like former Christians, and some of them are like straight up atheists, because they would watch some of my videos, discussing and challenging some religious ideas. But for some reason, a lot of them are materialists, and so they have a hard time hearing me leave a lot of my religious ideas and being open to this whole idea of out-of-body experiences, because they're just wondering, this might just be all just part of your brain, or you're just making this stuff up, or well, duh, Graham, people die every day, there's a crash every day, there's all these questions that could go inside people's minds, when they hear these kinds of stories. But what you shared, it is something to at least be open to the possibility that this was possibly a real incident that occurred. But in general, I am a skeptic, at least by its like original meaning, because I do think it is healthy, not to believe every single claim out there, because there are charlatans, there are fake mediums, there are people probably making up stories, but there's a problem that I've noticed where I see people dismissing some of these experiences despite a lot of the compelling evidence that's out there, simply because of their either, philosophical or theological commitments. And honestly, I do think that there's a lot of people who aren't even aware of the evidence and some of the case studies that are out there because it's probably not on their radar. But, if you could just answer this for me, like, how do you know you're not just dreaming all this stuff up, and hallucinating? Because maybe it's just all happening in your brain.
Okay, well, I guess I should start from the skeptic thing. Yes, if we're talking about the original definition of skeptic, then yes, I would be a skeptic in the sense that I require evidence and I evaluate everything and I use Occam's razor to see what would be the most feasible explanation. But the thing is, when I apply the skeptical arguments, if we're moving more towards the skeptical community or the skeptical activist movement, as I define them, then I think you get plausible explanations put forward. But the problem with a plausible explanation is it doesn't have any evidence to support it either. So we get into this tricky territory of we have to, I guess, categorize different types of experiences that we have and leave it at that because we can't ultimately know. But the way I approach things in terms of evidence and understanding and all of that is I take it in different avenues of evidence, if you like. So there's my personal experience, which I don't expect other people to necessarily take as any kind of evidence. But obviously for me, that's the starting point. What we can say is when someone has a near-death experience, especially when there's witnesses or an out-of-body experience, when someone has an experience like that and there's witnesses, the information is written down at the time the experience happens, and all of that information is recorded and confirmed, then I think we can say that that's a case study, not an anecdote. An anecdote is when you don't have any definite details, you don't have witnesses, you don't have confirmed details. So I make a distinction between anecdotes and case studies to start with. And then we have to take all of that and then say, okay, so that's a starting point. What can we do then? Do we have other evidence from a more controlled environment that also supports this kind of contention? The fact is we do. We have repeatable evidence of telepathy, precognition, and even out-of-body experiences, although the out-of-body experience research, there isn't very much. But Patrizio Tresoldi in Italy, for example, has done a recent study which came out with hugely statistically significant results. The expected level, for example, was 25%, and he actually got 66.7% accuracy in the experiences. And that's under controlled conditions using hypnosis to induce the out-of-body experiences. So you're taking something that's actually very difficult to fully control, as we've sort of covered, an out-of-body experience, and he's managed to control it to the degree that he's more, almost trebled the evidence for an out-of-body experience. So, from chance expectation. So, and I think that's across the board with psychical research. So I think that really, if we take an objective scientific perspective and we get rid of the biases and the emotions and the sort of taboos about it being related to religion or superstition and all of that kind of thing, that skeptics would argue, then I think we have to conclude that there is, consistent good evidence. We have a strong level of confidence in a scientific context.
Right. Because obviously there's a lot of people they wouldn't buy into like the anecdotal, the evidence, the stories that people share, even if it's a powerful personal experience that somebody has. So what you're saying though is that you can apply, I guess you could say, the scientific method to the out of body experiences, because you're saying that there were, I guess you could say, experiments that were done, that were testable and repeatable, and right.
Yeah,
Okay. I
yeah.
mean, so can you name any like specific, if anything that comes to mind, like any specific experiment that was done where someone gave some sort of verifiable information through an OBE? I mean, where they were able to give details aside. I mean, I know you had your airplane experience, but if there was like a controlled experiment, that was done where someone gave verifiable information that they couldn't have known otherwise.
Well, like I said, Patrizio Trasoldi's research in Italy. So if anyone looks up Patrizio Trasoldi, I know it's a bit of a difficult word,
Yeah, yeah.
name, Italian name, but he's in a university in Italy, Padova, I think it's called, the university. Um, I'm not totally sure off the top of my head, but
It's all
anyways,
good.
he's an Italian researcher. And as I mentioned, his results came in at
Yeah, 66.
66.7%,
Uh-huh.
when 25% would have been the chance level. So hugely statistically significant. And he's done a few different studies. So that's the most recent. It's in the last few years. So that's the most recent study, and he used multiple subjects. So
Yeah, I guess what I was getting at was more of like, did they like how were they set up? Was it more to put someone in a room? They'll have them induce some sort of, have them have an out of body experience, and then they have them go into another room and identify some sort of object or anything like that. Is that kind of what it was about?
yeah, that was essentially, but it was more controlled than that because the targets weren't even at the same location. The targets the targets were blind, so the experiments were all double, triple blind. Um, Basically, the a target would be set up at a remote location, probably even in another country or a different part of the country, etc. And the subject would be hypnotized. He used hypnosis in order to induce the OBEs. The subject would be hypnotized and then asked to describe the remote location and the object, etc. And then the data was then assessed by an independent judge. So someone not even involved in the experiments was asked to assess how accurate they were and to decide whether they, to decide which target or which object the independent judges thought that they had identified. So that means that the judge didn't know what the right answer was. The judge just had to say, I think this person is describing a camera, for example. So he writes down that he thinks that it was the camera that was the target. And that was what the 66.7% it came from. So he didn't know what the correct answer was. He didn't know who was involved. He may not have even known what the nature of the experiment was. I'm not sure about that. But essentially, it was a very controlled. There's no way anyone could have, cheated in any way because it wasn't even in the same location. So,
Right, right.
yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, so this is just for me playing devil's advocate, even though I believe you. But when it comes to the idea of consciousness, though, I mean, isn't consciousness basically an epiphenomenon? In other words, like, isn't it dependent upon the brain?
Oh, is it?
I mean, that's what they say, right? That's what a lot of the guys say. So,
Well, actually, no. Not many scientists say that. They say that that's probably what it is. But as I don't know either, we're in a situation where there's a thing called the hard problem of consciousness, which is essentially how do we get consciousness? If you take a materialistic perspective, how do we get consciousness from basically a load of neurons and
sure.
brain activity, etc. It doesn't make sense in many ways, and we can't actually find out how that process works. No one has actually figured out where consciousness is or what leads to consciousness. We only have correlations, essentially. We have, when something happens in the brain, there's a correlation. Uh, there's when something happens in the world, or we do something, interact in some way, there's a correlation to that action or interaction within the brain. That's as far as we can go, but that doesn't tell us how consciousness works. That just shows that something happens when we do things. So there's a big gap. Even the most hardcore skeptics. I recently debated Sue Blackmore in a radio debate, and even she, in the middle of the radio debate, I didn't bring it up. I was just mentioning that there are a lot of things in science that we're at a point that we don't fully understand yet how they work. We can see that they exist because of the phenomena that they produce. Dark matter is a good example of that. But we don't actually know how they work in detail, the specifics of what it actually is and how it's produced, etc., etc. And she used the example of consciousness, because we can see that we appear to be conscious, but at the same time, we don't really know how that can happen if you purely base things upon brains. So this is actually quite a strong argument for why there might be more to it. There's a very important book called Irreducible Mind.
Right.
And that book is basically packed with evidence that the mind cannot be reduced purely to the brain or functioning of the brain.
Yeah. No, I know there's a lot we could get into that. That's just one of the things that I know comes up, every so often when this topic is discussed. And so there is that, that hard problem of consciousness where you just can't like manipulate a bunch of atoms and, all of a sudden there's consciousness, And so I'm glad you're able to bring that up, but, don't worry, we're not going to talk about the whole time. What I do want to talk about next is just this whole idea of fear, surrounding this topic of OBEs. Why do you think there's so much? I mean, I don't know if you've experienced this from people that you deal with, but for me, I do. Why do you think there might be a lot of fear surrounding this whole topic of OBEs? Or let me frame it a different way. Like, what can you say to a lot of the Christians out there who would consider this stuff to be demonic or new age? Because like I said, I get this criticism a lot.
Well, I guess the first point is to look at. I guess if you're going to argue that something's demonic, you have to put forward exactly why something would be categorized into that context. I think to say that a spiritual experience is demonic, I put it this way. Quite a long time ago, I had a conversation with a priest about my out-of-body experiences, and I was a bit confused at the time. I was sort of a teenager or something when I had this conversation, and I was a bit confused at the time by why people would sometimes say this kind of thing, that, oh, it's bad or whatever, when I would look at the Bible, and I would see descriptions of people having visions and people having all kinds of types of experience, right. And I would also see there's a passage where in the Bible that references someone may have been in body or may have been out of body.
Paul,
there's a reference to that. So that almost suggests that out of body experiences are a positive thing in a biblical context. But the important thing is I asked this priest the question, and I think he gave a very good answer to the question, because he said the important thing is not the vision or not the experience that you had, but the important thing is the message or the interpretation that comes through that experience. The reason that the visions or the experiences that people had in the Bible are considered to be positive or spiritual or godly, and some other experiences are not, is because of the content and what they are communicating. So he said that if your experiences are leading you away from what you would essentially call a virtuous life or a good life, or being an ethical person, then you would want to question them, or probably say that they would fall into the category of something negative, or, if you like to use that kind of terminology, demonic. But if that experience is making you a better person or leading you towards something good, then probably you can say the origin of that is something good. The same way that you could say that with near-death experiences. People often say that they experienced God. They often say that they completely changed their lives. As I mentioned, I started my life in a situation where I grew up in a public housing project. There were lots of problems, lots of things going on around me, but my visions, which, like I mentioned, started as visions, led me at 10 years old to commit to never drink alcohol, to never take drugs, and I've stuck to that commitment since the age of 10. At a later date, because of my out of body experiences, because I experienced the life of an animal, or I saw kind of almost like the visionary experience, I felt an empathic or direct connection with that life. I realized that human beings are causing so much suffering and harm to the world around them, to other animals and things like that. So I became vegetarian when I was 16, and I became vegan later on. And so now I try to remove myself from harming or killing or any causes harm to anything around me as much as is possible. Obviously, there's limits to how much you can do that. And then it also led me towards reading people like Leo Tolstoy, who was an anarchist Christian, who was also vegetarian for the same reasons that I just gave. He believed in non-violence at the core of his spiritual or religious viewpoint, much like the Sermon on the Mount and the religious context of what Jesus was saying there about not using violence. So in many ways, I can see that my experiences have done exactly what that priest was describing. It led me towards being a more compassionate, more spiritual, more engaged person, and to be open to far more than I was in terms of a positive life than maybe most of the people that I grew up around, because they were influenced by different things.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought up the whole idea that there were people in the actual Bible that had out of what we could call out of body experiences, even though they don't, I guess, really use that term. They would probably say like, I was in the spirit, or yeah, there was Paul saying that I was in or out of the body, I do not know. So I mean, that seems to be evidence there that there was a possibility they had their own out of body experiences. But believe it or not, I've actually seen some articles by Christians who would even say, yeah, they would accept that though, but that's God ordained, but you shouldn't induce it yourself. So I don't understand that logic, but what would you say in response to those people who do think that way? Say, yeah, maybe people can have it, but it has to be something kind of like caused by God, and you shouldn't be learning these techniques and trying to make, yourself have one. What can you say kind of in response to that?
Well, I think in a sense, I think that they're coming from a fear-based position there. I don't. I think that there is a general belief that you can be harmed by the experience, which isn't true. I've done extensive research on it, and I've never found a single genuine case of anyone coming to any real harm from an experience. I've heard of people with sleep paralysis experiencing some really scary stuff, but sleep paralysis is a different thing, distinct from out of body experiences. And so is lucid dreaming, in my view. So if you don't want to have fearful experience, probably just avoid dreaming methodologies. But the key point, I think, with that is there are lots of things within spiritual practice that you're encouraged to do. you're encouraged to pray, you're encouraged to attend church, you're encouraged to live a virtuous life, you're encouraged to do certain actions within, well, virtually all the religions. And I think that an out of body experience is really, if you put it into more of a spiritual, forget about the science for a moment, if we just put it into more of a spiritual context, it's a way of connecting directly to your spirit, to your spiritual essence, your soul, your spirit, however you want to describe it. So how can connecting to the essence of your being, the thing that is supposed to be the infinite part of yourself, the part that is most fundamentally from God, how could that really be in any way problematic or demonic? It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. And I mean, that's why I love on how you were sharing on how your personal out of body experiences have made you, with, how you seem to be like a better person through these things, and you develop certain practices of things that you'd be abstaining from, of what you think would be a good life, for yourself. And so what you're saying is pretty much, it's like, it really depends on the content of what, it's not out of bodies, experience per se that's good or bad. It's just what's the person going to be experiencing, and what are they going to be learning from these things. So from yours, it's a positive thing. But from some people who would comment on my videos, they would post these negative articles of people having out of body and meeting different entities, and they would talk about negative entities, like dark and lying spirits deceiving people. They'll throw out Bible verses like, the devil's disguising himself as an angel of light. So even though you might be seeing these, what we can call even spirit guides or whatever, like, it's really the devil, disguising and deceiving you. And like, maybe you could even start up your own cult group or something. So I mean, like, how would you reply to these fear-based kind of ideas that people have, which keeps them from approaching this type of experience?
Well, as I mentioned, I think virtually every time someone mentions anything fearful to do with an experience, my first question is, were you having sleep paralysis? If they know what that is, of course. And in 90+% of cases, that will be the case. And I think that sleep paralysis is essentially a semi-waking nightmare.
Yeah.
For most people. So to me, a nightmare is not the same thing as an out-of-body experience. And I don't have my out-of-body experiences from sleep or dreams, I should point that out. I've never had sleep paralysis in my life. And I focus on using a conscious, intentional approach. And I don't have experiences of dark, demonic things ever. So I think that people who have that kind of stuff, it's nearly always, in my opinion, well, it's always either sleep paralysis or some kind of dream-based experience. So, but even if we were to accept that there was somehow some reality to that, there's still no instances of anyone actually being harmed by it. So I think that even if someone sort of argues that position, it's still very, very telling that it's just they felt some fear in an experience, but in probably a dream experience. And but at the end of the day, like a nightmare, you might feel frightened or whatever when you wake up, but we all know that a nightmare can't actually hurt you. It just scares you. And if you work on your own psychology, if you work on your own self, if you work on your own fears, then you probably won't be having any nightmares in future. Or even sleep paralysis can be worked with so that you can relax and find an inner peace within that experience. And then even sleep paralysis can reach a point where it's no longer fearful.
I mean, do you think? I mean, sorry to interrupt. I mean, do you think though that some of these scary experiences might be happening, possibly like a person's worldview kind of comes into play? Do you think? like with someone who believes in demons and the devil? I mean, do you think that plays a role of why people might be
Well,
experiencing?
sure, and I think that's another problem because I guess it's a bit like possession in general. You don't really come across any atheists who are, you know, in kind of spitting pea soup and all these kinds of things. I
uh,
think a lot of it is to do. I mean, the reason I reference that actually is I think a lot of this does also come from Hollywood and from films.
sure, good point.
Because a lot of these, I mean, if you take The Exorcist when it came out in the 1970s, there was a huge increase in people who believed they were possessed as a result of the film coming out. But when you actually look into the case that The Exorcist was based on, there's no evidence. Again, it comes down to it was based on a boy, we think, and the location of the boy is never consistent, and what actually happened isn't consistent. One of the only people who ever spoke to the priest who was involved felt that it was the priest's beliefs that influenced the boy rather than the other way around. So when you actually dig into most of the cases, which I have done, I spent decades looking for any evidence of any of this kind of thing because I thought that it was important to my own integrity teaching these kinds of things to see if I could actually find any real evidence of harm coming from an OBE. And I can say that to this day, I've never found a case that once you looked into it was, stood up on its own.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess you could kind of say that a lot of the experiences that we have might be coming from our beliefs, or we could be projecting some of these negative experiences, like even when I was a kid, I was so into what we would call like spiritual warfare. I don't know if you heard that term before, but, I would constantly have nightmares and, see demons and see stuff even when I was a kid. And then when I kind of stopped thinking about that, and I kind of became more skeptical, believe it or not, I stopped seeing those things, but then,
Sure.
it's funny, but how some religious folks would kind of turn that around and say, oh, that's because you're not seeing that stuff because you're not doing God's work. So the devil's not really mad at you. You know what I mean? So they always have like something to use against you. But I was just coaching someone just recently, and she was even talking about how she was scared because of her sleep paralysis, but because she saw one of my videos, I actually did a video on sleep paralysis, and I was just kind of showing on what sleep paralysis might actually be, where it's not necessarily like this thing with some person coming on top of you, but a lot of it could possibly be like things from our inner psyche, things that we're projecting, and a movie that we watched just like right before we went to bed, and actually encouraging people, if they've learned to just kind of be neutral about it, that it's just like a normal thing that the body does when it goes to bed. You could even turn it into like an out-of-body experience. It could be kind of like a prelude to that, and so like you, I don't really experience sleep paralysis anymore, but I have experienced it in the past, and it wasn't scary for me at all. I remember when I had it, my mind, I was literally just thinking, oh, I heard about this while it was happening, and I couldn't move. But it's just like I've seen a lot of my friends who have this worldview that's very much about the devil, Satan, attacking you. It's like they see stuff, you know what I'm saying? And so I think that's one of the things I kind of wanted to bring into this, is that I do believe that our beliefs do matter, in many ways, where things from our psyche just kind of get mixed in with quote unquote reality, whatever that means sometimes. But yeah, I'm glad you're sharing that, and you come off I like on how you're very neutral, where you're not as very like matter of fact, where you're open to different possibilities. And yeah, man, so you're sharing a lot of good things, and we could go all day like presenting, several lines of evidence for the objectivity of an OBE, but what do you think might be the best evidence to possibly convince a skeptic of this reality?
Well, I think the converging evidence and the sheer body of evidence for within parapsychology. So the evidence looking at out of body experiences, which we've already talked about, the evidence from prospective studies in near death research. So Penny Sartori's research in the UK, Pim van Lommel's research in the Netherlands, people like that, and then just the real laboratory research looking at other forms of extrasensory perception, so things like telepathy, precognition, etc. But I think what it comes down to when we sort of look at skepticism and things like that is, I think most people have essentially an emotional connection to a particular worldview, and it's very hard for all of us, me included, everyone, to be objective, to truly be objective, and
Sure.
to truly step outside of our emotional beliefs. There's an excellent book by a journalist from the UK called Will Storr. It's called The Heretics in the UK. I think it's called something else in the US, but anyway, it's by Will Storr. And in that book, there's a great moment because he goes and he speaks to Rupert Sheldrake, for example, who I've done telepathy experiments and precognition experiments with. And he goes and talks to Rupert Sheldrake, and Rupert Sheldrake puts his perspective across from the position of the science is very strong for psychic abilities. And then he goes and talks to a group of skeptics, and the skeptics, he asks the skeptics, why is it that you have this, that you think that this really matters so much? And one of them says, oh, well, it's things like homeopathy. If people believe in homeopathy, they might take that, which is essentially water, they might take that water instead of medicine, and then they could get very, very sick. They could even die because they haven't gone and got proper medical help, and they've taken the homeopathy. And then Will Storr, I thought this was so beautiful. Will Storr just said, so do you know of a situation when that's happened? And they didn't. Not one of them had an example of that. But this was the story they were telling themselves.
Sure.
Of why they were skeptical. When I think for many people, it's simply they want to be right. They want to feel that they have the right answer. And I think that can be the problem in religion, in science, in many, many areas. And I think that's why I try to take this open, sort of neutral view, because I'm a human being, I'm fallible, no one is right. Everyone has interpretations, and we have to remember that the likelihood is we're wrong about a hell of a lot of things.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, would you also possibly add on that one of the most powerful things to possibly convince a skeptic would be a personal out-of-body experience for them to have? Do you think that would change someone's mind, or at least be more powerful than just all these experimentations that we can offer to them?
I doubt it, actually, because I think that they usually sort of compartmentalize, or they put it out of their mind, or if it didn't have a veridical component, for example, then they're quite easily able to put that into a sort of, oh, it was just a hallucination. And I have met plenty of skeptics who had experiences and have just dismissed them without really even looking into them.
Right. And you debated Susan Blackmore, who did have an OBE, correct?
Yeah, but she was also on drugs.
Yeah, I remember that.
And there's some big question marks around that. But Sue was a very good example. I've written a very long blog post about my meeting with her, which I'll be posting when it comes out. It was interesting. It was on a Christian radio station, actually.
Oh, was it? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to that.
So the host is a Christian, and then there's me, who I guess you would say is spiritual, but
Sure.
I don't know what category I come into. And then Susan Blackmore, who's a skeptic, and but it was interesting because she was unwilling really to engage with any of the evidence, and she pretty much sort of dismissed everything. And for me, sort of, I guess, analysing her responses, it felt very much that I was dealing with someone who
already has a commitment to
has a commitment, bias to a particular point of view, and is not willing to really engage anymore. Maybe she was in the past, but in that particular conversation, her arguments, as I mentioned earlier, she used the plausible explanation argument, which is, oh, it could have been this, even though there's no evidence that it was that, or you know. And the thing is, often when I debate skeptics, they assume that I haven't thought of these possibilities. For, for example, she said, "Oh, one of the arguments was that I might have been able to see this information earlier on," and I'd actually gone back and checked whether that was possible by looking at photographic evidence, going through all sorts of different things. So I'd already thought of that possibility, and I'd looked into it, and it didn't hold up. This is what I mean about being sort of skeptical in, as you said, the old meaning of the word, that I use the hardest uh, criteria and the hardest evidence against my own experiences. But if at the end of the day they, all of the skeptical arguments don't explain them, then it would be irrational of me to conclude that there's not anything to them. And there's been witnesses to multiple of my experiences as well. So it's not even just going by me. It's like other people have seen it as well. So
Yeah, that's why
yeah.
I appreciate what you do, man. Yeah, I mean, like, do you have any closing thoughts before we wrap up? Any advice you want to give to my listeners?
I think it's just about focusing on the positive in terms of the fears and things like that. I think it's important that we all just focus on compassion, having a positive, open attitude towards life and ideas. And, you don't have to assume any one position when it comes to these things in terms of religion. There's nothing in the religion that says anything about this is wrong. There really isn't. And then to the skeptics, I think, well, maybe having an experience, maybe exploring it, maybe just being neutral. I think everything in science should be neutral. Everything should be. It's about levels of confidence. We can't say categorically one thing is true and one thing's not true. What we can say is we have confidence, a level of confidence. And the thing is, there is a whole body of data out there, and it's so easy when an idea comes forward to just go onto Google and say arguments against that particular position and just look for anything to not take on board what you're hearing. But I think what's more important is to say, well, if I looked at it neutrally, if I was really honest with myself and with my ideas, and I just looked at it neutrally and took a step back, is there evidence? Is there a reason to maybe take on board some of these things? And I think it's a bit like how things can get with not killing animals or something like that for food. People will make all kinds of excuses, but if you just ask yourself the question, would that be a better way to be? Would that be a better option for those animals and for the world around us? It's a similar thing. We just, I think it's just about saying what could be the better option in our lives in general, spiritually and personally. So that would be my thought, I guess.
Awesome. Yeah, I appreciate your advice. Oh, I mean, so what's next for you now? I mean, you had that debate with Susan Blackmore. Do you know when that's going to be available?
It should be in the next couple of weeks, I think.
Okay, I'll be looking out for that. I mean, are you working on your next book, or what you got going on?
I am, yeah. Yeah, I'm working. The next book is going to be more about those questions of life after death and that kind of thing. Uh, so I'm going to explore that with some really amazing cases that I've personally investigated, plus my own cases, plus some of the science, although I'm trying to make it very um, narrative and inspiring to read as well.
Awesome,
So
awesome. And do you know when that might be out?
I'm not sure about the date for that one yet.
Oh,
So
okay.
yeah.
Well, yeah, we'll look out for that though. How can my listeners keep in touch with you? What's your website?
My website is grahamnichols.com. So there's plenty of articles and blog posts and things like that on there. There's also courses and private tuition and things like that. So if people want to learn more about what I do, and I'm always open to emails as well, so they can go on the contact page and send me a question, and they can also add me on Facebook
Yeah. Facebook, Twitter, you're on all those things.
I'm not a huge social media person,
Okay.
but
It's okay.
I do have some things, and I've also got, for example, one of my veridical OBEs, well, two of them with witnesses on my YouTube channel as well, so they can have a look at
Okay,
that
so you got a
too.
YouTube. Yeah, that's right. So that's the website, you guys. So it's Graham Nicholls, but it's spelled NICHOLLS.com. And so he said he has a Facebook, Twitter. Check out his YouTube channel, and also check out Graham's book, Navigating the Out of Body Experience and Avenues of the Human Spirit, on Amazon.com. And if you'd like to support the show financially and help keep it going, that would really mean a lot. You can just go to patreon.com/Joshua Tongol. That's www.patreon.com/Joshua Tongol. And so don't forget to subscribe to this channel and my podcast on iTunes. And if you can, just take a moment and write a review and rate it. It only takes like 2 minutes, because it'll help more people discover the show. And of course, please share this interview with your friends. And so, Graham, it was nice chatting with you, bro. I really appreciate you making the time and just your experience and the knowledge that you could share with all of us, man. And so thanks for being on the show.
Thanks, it was really great to be on.
Awesome. So alrighty, guys, once again, thanks for listening, and I'll catch you guys on the flip side. I'm out. Peace.